The show is bad, better use of sources would have made it less bad, and some of its creative liberties were pretty revealing. Those About to Die is Peacock's epic to rival Game of Thrones, $140 million epic, reportedly. The show has endless subplots and minor characters, but 5 major plot lines. Tenax, the slum bookie trying to break into high society, is joined by Scorpus, a mega-celebrity charioteer. Calla, who comes to Rome from Numidia to rescue her 3 children who've been enslaved. Aura and Jula join the political fray, while Kwame is forced to be a gladiator. Domitian and Titus are vying for power as their father Vespasian totters towards the grave. Antonia and Marsus are wealthy patricians who are trying to make sure they stay on top. And lastly, you've got 3 brothers who come to Rome from Spain to sell their pretty horsies. All of this drama unfolds as the Flavian amphitheater looms ever more ominously in the background. The show also follows Game of Thrones in its aesthetic of grim realism. There's a spotlight on human ugliness and ambiguity. The bad guys have their sympathetic moments, and the good guys are inevitably forced to make horrible choices. Everything is grit, intensity, and extravagance, which is a great fit for the Flavian era. Critiques are coming, but I want to start by saying this was a good pick for a Roman Game of Thrones. The Flavian period is power, violence, intrigue, spectacle, all converging on the Colosseum, which, unlike dragons in Westeros, is real. A show like this gets to revel in savageries while claiming, "Don't blame us, we're but humble vessels of history, and wasn't it foul? Let's linger on every odious detail." Judgmentally, of course. And the best part is that this is also how some Romans talked about Rome. If you told Juvenal that you were making art about Rome's sundry vices, he'd say, "Oh, do you need material? Because I was just standing on a street corner filling up whole notebooks on this very topic." And I was psyched to see chariot racing in the limelight. Gladiators get more press, but chariot racing was the Roman sport. Sports in general are the heart of the show. The director, Roland Emmerich, said it was their psychology that interested him. I've always been fascinated by the Roman Empire, and I've always wanted to do something with sports because I'm fascinated by why people watch sports. We'll come back to that, but I do think the show had some good takes on sports, admittedly as someone who doesn't play or watch them. I did think, though, that they had an interesting take with Scorpus and celebrity, because Scorpus was a real celebrity. We know he drove fast and died young, and we've even got some poems mourning his death, but the show gives us a lot more. One character describes racing as a suicide you somehow survive, and we see the effects of that on Scorpus. He's sacrificed everything for racing. He's in mortal danger whenever he competes, he's watched his friends die on the tracks, he's functionally owned by the team, and he even says, "I changed my name to Scorpus because people couldn't pronounce my real name." And after all that, his success is meaningless. His fame is fragile, and his money never buys real autonomy, so underneath his veneer of partying and drinking, he's deeply depressed. To me, that's an interesting engagement with history. Scorpus is clearly based on some contemporary conversations about athletes and fame, but the result is subjectivity that you'll only find in fiction. Those poems mourning Scorpus as the glory of the roaring circus don't care about his mental health. Those About to Die adds depth. And the show also never promises good history. I want to take them on their own terms. They might prefer the aesthetic of realism, but they clearly prefer drama over accuracy. It's all about the spectacle of scale. Big wealth, big crowds, lions the size of a pickup truck. And who doesn't love big lions? That's not a big deal. Even an earnest vision of Rome, like Italo Gismondi's 3D model, involved what he called un po' di fantasia, a bit of fantasy. Those About to Die can have more than a bit. There's plenty they do that's wrong, but improves the show. Like, they off Titus early, but it would have been awkward to try and fit in all 3 years of his reign, and also, he's so boring. Get him out of there, exit Titus. Or how they handled the gold racing team. The gold and purple teams were added by Domitian during his reign, but in the show, it's just the gold team, it's before Domitian is emperor, and they make it Tenax's idea. He wants the new team to give him power and legitimacy, and Domitian only gets involved because it suits some other plans. But this adds intrigue to the creation of the team, it turns it into the scheme between the city's gutter and its imperial palace, and it lets me watch pretty ponies prancing around in a golden chariot. What am I gonna do? Say no? Or even how they have the gladiators say, "Those about to die salute you" before each match. This only shows up once in our sources, about one particular fight. It was 52 AD, under the Emperor Claudius. Some prisoners who'd been condemned to die in the arena turned to him and said this phrase. And the meaning was less, "We sad wretches acknowledge we're about to die," and more, "We're pleading with you, Emperor Claudius. If you don't do something, we'll die." Claudius, by the way, is said to have replied, "Or not." So its use here is inaccurate and misleading and clunky, in my humble opinion, but it does lay out one of the show's central questions, which is who controls your fate. The gladiators are owned by the imperial family is afraid of the crowd is being starved by the imperial family, and they vent their frustrations on the gladiators. The show is very invested in that tension and cause and effect. Everyone's about to die, and they're all saluting each other. So fine, let them say it. Salute away. My problems start when it's stuff no one said, ever. Like multiple characters say, this conversation needs to be held under 4 eyes, to mean, let's talk in private. No one said that. Not in antiquity, that's not a thing people say. Why would they say that? So clunky and awkward, and conversations happened under ears. I think this kind of thing comes from an awareness that an ancient perspective would have sounded different, but then the writers compensate by just making up stuff that sounds different. It's not even that it's a bit of fantasy here, it's that it's a bad bit. That is bad dialogue. And you can't blame that on that's how it was, because that's not how it was. That's you saying that. And it's so stilted and dry. This clunk is everywhere, and it saps the impact. Like another thing that gets said a lot is the year of 4 emperors, to refer to 69 AD. Now, Rome did have 4 rulers that year. At the end of 68, Nero was pushed out of office, so Galba takes over, but by January of 69, he was assassinated in Rome, in the middle of the Forum, and afterwards he was decapitated, so his head could be displayed on a pike. So Otho takes over. But not for long, because Vitellius has been rallying his troops in the north. By March, Otho is embroiled in a civil war, and in April he decides to end his life rather than continue that war. So Vitellius takes over, but not for long, because the general Vespasian has been rallying his troops in the east. Vespasian marches on Rome, killing as many as 50,000 people. Vitellius is executed in the city by being thrown down the Gemonian steps, and afterward he's also decapitated so his head could be paraded through the streets. Vespasian assumes the throne in late December, and voila, 1 year, 4 emperors. You'll find that term in any textbook, because if you're a historian who's used to reckoning by who's in charge, that's a useful term. But if you lived through something like that, think about it. The emperor is pushed out of office. Nero was hated, but he was also the government. And more than that, he was from the same family that had been in power for the entirety of Rome as an empire. And that family had only taken power after a brutal civil war. Nero being deposed was the end of all the stability and continuity he represented. And he's not even one of the 4. That was just the beginning. The whole government collapses 3 times, twice into civil war. And at the end of it, you have someone who is in charge not because he has any legitimate claim to the throne, but because he was the best at butchering his own people. Here's how Tacitus, a historian who lived through this period, describes not just that year, but the whole Flavian regime. The history I'm taking up is brimming with disasters, horrible in its battles, churning with rebellion, cruel even in peace. Sacred rites were defiled, there were scandalous relationships amongst the powerful, the sea was full of exiles, the cliffs stained with corpses. The cruelty was even fiercer in Rome. Nobility, wealth, offices accepted or refused were all considered criminal, and there was no surer death sentence than being virtuous. Slaves were corrupted against their masters, freedmen against their patrons, and those who had no enemies were struck down by their friends. And that's his dry take for the history books. The beauty of Those About to Die is that it's not a history book. So stop making your characters parrot textbooks. Commit to the bit. The writers left so much on the table from this period. Stuff you'd think they'd want. Stuff that fits the premise and themes that they chose. We get a flashback, for instance, to Vespasian writing a speech about the new amphitheater. There's a bit of rhetoric about how Nero built a palace for himself and Vespasian is building entertainment for the people. Domitian adds that the Colosseum will help them make money and thus sap power from the Circus Maximus and the patricians who so resent our ascent. This line is everything that the show does wrong about politics. For some reason, they turn the entire economic and political landscape of Rome into chariot racing. It's not that they're just focusing on it. That is it. That's the entire thing. The patrician families all have money and power from owning shares in the 4 major teams, and all their cloak and dagger stuff is about becoming the premier owner. And meanwhile, the Flavians are trying to build the amphitheater so they can siphon off some of their income streams. And all of this is discussed like it isn't the silliest thing on earth. Roman wealth came from things like taxes, trade, conquest, exploiting the provinces, exploiting slave labor, huge estates in the country. All of those things are what create the hyper-wealthy and the desperately poor, the mob that everyone is so afraid of. And that relationship, that cause and effect, is central to the show, so why cheapen it? And the counterpart to that is, if you're a wealthy Roman nobleman, public entertainment is not about making money, it is about spending it. The idea that you'd earn money off of the amphitheater is backwards. The Flavians spent a ton to make the amphitheater, and then they kept spending to put on shows, to repair the thing when it was on fire or struck by lightning or whatever. And that's the whole point. The amphitheater wasn't a prize for the Flavians, it was a cost. It was an investment that they made that they then kept making. The question is why? Why would they do that? And the answer is the one the writer should want, because it's hedonism, destruction, fear, power, spectacle. It starts with a devastating fire in 64. This thing raged for days, it destroyed huge parts of the city, and when Nero rebuilt the city afterwards, he took a lot of those parts and used them for his own personal pleasure palace, the Domus Aurea, his golden house. This thing included, not just sprawling structures, but also a personal park, an artificial lake, and an enormous statue of himself called the Colossus of Nero. It was just this massive, decadent use of space, and it was a slap in the face of the Roman people. I've put up some images just so you get a sense of it, but if you're looking at them and thinking, well, I guess it gives me some information, but I don't really get a sense of scale or impact or drama. Yeah, I agree. If only I had 140 million to make a more immersive version for you. Don't give us a flashback of the Flavians writing a speech about the Domus Aurea. Give us a flashback of them destroying it. The director is the guy who did Independence Day. Turning buildings into rubble is in his wheelhouse. The Domus Aurea and the Civil War are central to the creation of the amphitheater. It's the Flavians saying, look, we can do whatever we want. We control this landscape because we butchered people for the privilege. But isn't it nice that we're being so nice? Nero was so mean, and we're being so nice. We're good emperors. We deserve to be in power. And isn't this show a nicer thing to look at than that spot over there where we killed the last guy, or those streets through which we paraded with his severed head? The amphitheaters, the Flavians bid for legitimacy, their offer of goodwill, an expression of their control, and an attempt at permanence. Because if the year of 4 emperors had taught anybody anything, it was that emperors are fungible. To give the show credit, they do gesture at this, but it's in that same dry, stilted way that people have conversations under 4 eyes. It comes up in speeches, there's quick references, or you see the Colossus of Nero peeking out from behind the amphitheater every so often. And come on, let its shadow fall over people at the very least. If you want the spectacle of scale, it's literally colossal, and the Flavians left it up for a reason. It's a message. With this statue, Nero made you feel small. With this amphitheater next to it, we're gonna make you feel big. Even bigger than this comically oversized lion. And it's a message for the emperors too. No matter how big you are, Nero was that big, and he was still cut down to size. Like Galba, like Otho, like Vitellius, like Vespasian, like everyone in the end. Everyone's about to die, even the emperors. And that brings me to Titus and Vespasian, and my biggest issue with the show. There's a dichotomy between these two. Neither of them is a good guy, but Titus is definitely better, and Domitian is definitely worse. Titus is trying to ship grain into Rome to feed the poor, while Domitian is sabotaging that shipment. Titus is disgusted by the senseless violence of the arena, while Domitian adores it. Titus is an honest soldier, while Domitian is a scheming political animal. Both of them do cruel and underhanded things, but when Titus does them, that's him learning how to play Domitian's game. In general, Titus is trying to do the right thing, and even some of his shadier moves seem sympathetic. The big one is his relationship with Berenike, the queen of the Judeans, Titus captured during his sack of Jerusalem. That's them conflating Titus's real-life sack of Jerusalem with his real-life relationship with Berenike, who'd actually sided with Titus during that conflict. Anyway, Titus loves her. He's genuinely in love with her. He wants to marry her, he wants to make all of Rome respect her, and that's a big risk because she is reviled by Rome as a foreign queen. So the fact that Titus is so devoted to her, even at the expense of his personal dignity, is one of the ways that the writers show that even though Rome is a cesspool of corruption and decay, and Titus is not immune to that, he's still trying to do the right thing. Whereas Domitian never tries to do the right thing, and that also shows up in his personal relationships. He has no intimacy with anyone except this one guy, Hermes, whom he constantly belittles, despite the fact that Hermes is always really nice to him and is always proving his usefulness. Inevitably, though, Hermes is unfaithful, and Domitian mutilates him and then has him gruesomely executed in the arena. That relationship is one of the key ways that the writers show that Domitian sucks. That dichotomy is not the issue. It's actually a pretty ancient perspective. Suetonius, for instance, would love that take. He starts his biography of Titus by saying he was dear and darling to all humanity, while he starts his biography of Domitian by saying that that guy used to sit locked in his room alone for hours every day to do nothing more than capture flies and stab them with a sharp pen. That's not a subtle difference, right? Titus good, Domitian bad, ancient take. Our sources do offer more depth, though. Like in the show, Titus is the ultimate soldier. One review calls him stone-faced Titus, forever armored, a model of soldierly rectitude. Whereas Domitian would never step foot on a battlefield. He is not going on campaign. But if you look at our sources, Domitian does actually go on several campaigns. The criticism is just that he's not good at them. That's still not the issue, though. I get why the writers might want to flatten these guys a little because it makes the differences stand out more. Titus strong soldier, Domitian weak baby. Fine, that's the story they want to tell. Then there's the stuff about the games. In the show, Domitian loves them, but Titus hates them. He's always frowning at them and saying, "It's a pity to see such virtue wasted in sport." Whereas, if you look at Suetonius, he says that Titus loved gladiator games. He openly showed his enthusiasm for Thracian gladiators, and with the people cheered them on by shouting and waving like a regular fan, but still keeping his dignity and calm demeanor. You can see in that passage how being a fan of gladiators isn't necessarily a good thing, even for the Romans. It's the fact that Titus was still cute about it, somehow. He managed to turn what should be a vice into a virtue because he was so well liked otherwise. And if you ask me, I would have put that in the show. I think it would have been more interesting, a more nuanced take, and something that relates more closely to their theme of why do people watch sports if you have even your good guy, your good emperor, into a very cruel sport. But again, that's not what the story that the writers wanted to tell. They wanted to say that the good guy doesn't enjoy these things and the bad guy does. So fine. That's still not the issue. It's just the context. The issue is how their relationships relate to all that context. Because yes, Titus was associated with Berenike, but he was also famously accompanied by flocks of boyfriends and eunuchs, to the point that when Domitian later made castration illegal, people assumed that he had done it to insult Titus's memory. Domitian, on the other hand, was famous for two relationships, one with his wife, Domitia, and the other with his niece, Julia. The accounts of both of them are ugly. He suspected Domitia of having an affair with an actor named Paris, so he divorced her and had him killed, and even killed one of his students because he looked like him, before ultimately demanding Domitia come back to this marriage. And that's nothing compared to his relationship with Julia. According to our sources, he ended her life by forcing her to have an abortion when she was pregnant with his child. So if you want a narrative about how Domitian is horrible and how that shows up in his personal relationships, the ancient sources have you covered. You have options, but the writers didn't want those options. That's not the story they wanted to tell. They wanted to tell a story where the strong soldier guy who's always trying to do the right thing is only with a woman, and where the weak, cruel, scheming guy who adores the torment of people in the arena is only with a man. And don't get me wrong, I love a queer villain. It's 2024. We can be anything, even evil. But if you're not careful, taking an evil emperor and making him queer starts to look like you're making him queer to show that he's evil, especially if you're erasing any sense of queerness from the other guy. That's my issue. And my question is why? Why is that the story you want to tell? Now, Domitian and Hermes aren't the only queer characters. There's also Aura, who reveals late in the season that she's queer right before selling herself into slavery. And then there's Xenon, who ruins his budding friendship with Scorpus by kissing him. Scorpus is shocked and disinterested, and Xenon dies in the next race. Then you've got Caltonia, who reveals she's queer when she assaults someone. These are all original characters. These are just stories that the writers wanted to tell. And again, my question is why? Why these stories? Why do they feel right? I could say a lot more about this show, but I am trying to keep this video short, so I just want to end on that note. I'd love to hear your comments. Did you like this show? What did you like about it? What did you dislike about it? Let me know. And if you're interested in more explorations of the Roman world, please consider subscribing. Or not.